Today we are going over some trade conversation involving the Minnesota Wild and the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, these are two separate ideas. They're not necessarily linked, but what I wanted to do was go over two of these young guys that are on these teams that have been tossed out there in the rumor mill as to whether or not they could, would, or should get moved. Let's start out with the Minnesota Wild, because this is actually something that was brought up on The Athletic, and I wanted to really explore this because last time we heard word as to this player potentially getting moved, it was met with some controversy, maybe not really too much, but at the same time, it was something that many fans were kind of concerned about. So today's source is The Athletic. We have ourselves an article published by Michael Russo and Joe Smith from April 24th, 2024. What could the Minnesota Wild get for Gustafsson, and will they trade Marco Rossi? Yeah, that's the title. Now, article will be linked in the description if you want to go ahead and read it. Of course, The Athletic is paid for content, so we're not going to go out there and screenshot this. But Marco Rossi, just to get the introductory segment out of the way here, is indeed one of our subjects. He's 22 years old, 5'9", 183, left-handed guy signed to the end of 2025 on his ELC. Initially a 9th overall draftee by the Minnesota Wild, he put up 40 points in 82 games played with Minnesota this season. He was one of the top rookies. He was a really strong player in his draft-eligible year in 2019-20 with the Ottawa 67s. He was a double point-per-game guy, and I'm pretty sure he was one of the only guys who was near the top in the CHL in points alongside of Alexis Lafreniere. Even though he was small, even though he wasn't the most mobile, Marco Rossi is just a guy who knows how to play the game right. And you can see this with the way he processes his decisions on the ice, how he doesn't need to work all too hard because he just makes the right plays. He puts himself in the right spot. He makes the right puck movements. He opens up space. And he's able to shoot, he can make passes, he can produce points, and his hockey brain was just so superior to everybody else around him that it helped him out in getting 120 points that season in the OHL. As his career went on, though, Marco Rossi literally almost died with COVID complications, and it was a really scary time for the young prospect, but eventually working his way over into the Iowa Wild system and Minnesota soon after, he became a mainstay guy, posting up the season that he did. Now, because The Athletic is paid for material, we're heading over onto Spectre's Hockey from earlier today, April 27th, 2024, because Lyle Richardson goes out there and describes the conversation about Rossi and a potential trade. Take a look at this. Russo and Smith, the two writers of the Athletic piece, they both think that the Minnesota Wild can trade Marco Rossi this summer if they can get the same level of a high-end prospect who is bigger and faster. They were interested in Cutter Gauthier before the Flyers traded him to the Anaheim Ducks in January. That's the type of player they might consider for Rossi. Now, that is very intriguing how it's specifically labeled out that his speed and his size are two things that the Wild may want to improve upon. And honestly, if I'm thinking about this rationally here, I'm kind of saying to myself, okay, if size and speed are an issue with Marco Rossi, then why'd you draft the guy in the first place? I mean, he was taken in 2020. That was just 4 years ago. Bill Guerin was the GM of this team for a while. Judd Brackett has been a part of this team for a while, ever since he left the Vancouver Canucks organization. This is pretty much the same personnel, it's the same scouting staff, it's the same group of guys that were in charge of bringing Rossi over to Minnesota in the first place, and so if this was the path that he was going to take, why'd you take him? I mean, Marco Rossi in 2020 was not really the fastest guy either. As we had said, he made his bread and butter with his hockey smarts and his great shiftiness, not necessarily foot speed. His size was never going to be there because he was always 5'8", 5'9", so now he's 22 years old. You're taking a look at him and you're saying, yeah, no, he's a little too small, he's a little too slow, he just had a rookie season where he had 40 points, let's trade him. Let's get a bigger guy. If that was the case, then why did you not use your 9th overall pick in 2020 to draft somebody else who was a lot bigger, let's just say a Dylan Holloway, who went a little bit later? Anton Lundell is also a center. He was taken shortly after. I mean, there are a lot of big guys that were available after Marco Rossi. Not giants per se, but just guys that were bigger. There are a lot of other options here. And realistically, the Minnesota Wild talking about this in a way where it's yeah, we're kind of giving up on our prospect at 22 years old. That is very interesting to me. Also, it should be said that Rossi has not had a proper development like many of the other prospects have had, because he missed out pretty much on the entire 2020-2021 season, not because his league didn't play, but because he straight up almost died. Like, does that not help his case out even just a little bit more, where you start thinking, okay, maybe we should give him a bit more leeway, a bit more benefit of the doubt, because he was already a point-per-game guy in the AHL last year. And this season, after being given an actual role on the National Hockey League team, he was half a point a game. Much better than the 1 point that he had in 19 games last year. So for Marco Rossi, with the idea that the Minnesota Wild legitimately could trade this guy, I'm starting to wonder where exactly this is going to go, because long-term, I still do believe in Rossi. At the 2020 draft, I was pretty much one of the guys saying that, yeah, Rossi could have 80, 90 point potential. Like, he's so smart, and if he pans out, things could really go well for him, but this is just one of the two guys that I wanted to talk about in today's video. Let's go over onto an article published on sportsnet.ca. This is 32 thoughts from earlier last week, April 20th, 420, on, yeah, the weed day. We're not going to go out there and talk more about that, but yeah, this was published, 32 thoughts. Elliot Friedman went out there and talked about the Philadelphia Flyers later on in this segment, and it is a fairly interesting conversation. Take a look at thought number 23. Flyers president Keith Jones said a few weeks ago that moving Tortorella upstairs is not something that has entered any conversation. He's the coach, and he's really good at it. Even though they're disappointed that the team fell short, Jones and GM Danny Briere, who were mentally tough players, strongly believe what their young guys went through will benefit them in the long run. Torts is really important, Jones added. He's outstanding at developing young players and developing accountability. Guys have thrived, and the players deserve a ton of credit too. How well they get along, how cohesive they are, how much they hate losing and enjoy winning, these are all good signs from the inside. They're expected to announce a 2-year extension for Ivan Fedotov at some point, and Samuel Ersson took huge steps in less than ideal conditions. A lot of their young players, from Cam York to Morgan Frost to Tyson Forrester, improved their standing. Cam Atkinson, though, made it sound like he will start anew in 24-25, and the other one I wonder about is Joel Farabee. Now, Farabee is a very intriguing conversation to me, too, because he's one of these guys that, when it comes to, like, the next wave of flashy, high-octane point producers that were top picks in the 2018 draft, Farabee's right up there. I mean, 6 feet, 183, left-handed guy, signed till the end of 2028, making $5 million a year, 14th overall pick by Philly in that 2018 draft. He was drafted for his foot speed, his two-way play, his offensive productivity. He was an absolute sniper for the NTDP back in his days there and at BC. But eventually making the NHL, Farabee had himself what was a career year this season, getting 50 points, 22 goals, and 28 assists in 82 games played. This was the best season yet for Farabee, but Friedman is wondering whether or not the idea is there that he could get traded. This is where we go over to another article. We're going to a third piece over here. Jonathan Bailey goes out there and asks the question on Philadelphia Hockey Now, could the Flyers really trade Joel Farabee? He goes out there and writes this. When there's smoke, there's fire, and Farabee, like Atkinson, sounded like a player who was not completely satisfied with his role on the Flyers down the stretch. In a year after the All-Star break, I think the games are a lot harder. Teams are fighting for playoff spots, so the game changes a little bit, Farabee said of his second half on Tuesday. I think my role in the team, too, where I was playing, I think I'm one of the guys that can play up and down the lineup for sure. I think when you're playing on the third, fourth line, sometimes you have to give up some of the offense to focus on the defensive game and focus on the defensive side of things. I personally would love to play as much as I can, but like I said, whatever role I'm given that night, I'll just try to do to the best of my ability. And so with this in mind, Farabee's deployment, Farabee's playing time, and Farabee's contract, this should be a very attractive option. I mean, Farabee was playing roughly 10-ish minutes a night to end off the season, and that's when he stopped producing points. I mean, he really did get the short end of the stick when it came to development, and there could be a reason for him to maybe want out if that is the case. He's making $5 million, but he's being played in the bottom 6, and he's a guy who has a lot more offensive potential than that. So if Farabee does get moved, this may be a really good opportunity for him to get a better playing position, a better role, and even more points, because if he maxes out to what he could be, let's say Farabee gets 60, 70 points a year, for $5 million a season, that's really good, I'd think. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Firstly, about the Marco Rossi trade idea that we had talked about. I kind of feel bad because I mostly made this video a Marco Rossi talk, but the Farabee stuff is interesting too, because there is more logic attached to it, I would say. So thoughts in the comment section if you're a Flyers or a Wild fan. What are your opinions on Rossi and Farabee, and could they get traded? I hope you enjoyed this Vrishashros 9. and bye.